Welcome to the open forum session from the MASTS Marine Planning and Governance Forum. I will now hand over to Sinead Sheridan.
Thanks so much, Phil. I'm going to share my screen. Please let me know if that's visible. Hopefully everybody can see that. Good stuff. Okay, so thank you very much for joining us, everyone, today for this session on policy approaches to enhancing the marine and coastal environment. This session has been organised by the MASTS Marine Planning and Governance Forum. Thank you to MASTS and to Chrissy and Phil for helping with the organisation and support of this event. So my name is Sinead. I work at NatureScot as a marine planning and policy advisor, and I co-convene the MASTS Planning and Governance Forum alongside Rachel Shuck-Smith, who I believe is on the call. So give a wave, Rachel, or stick something into the chat just so folk can see you as well. So we co-convene the MASTS Marine Planning and Governance Forum session, and the idea for this session came about through discussion of the steering group and really a desire to understand more about the developing and fastly evolving policy approaches to enhancing the marine and coastal environment, and awareness that there are developing approaches on this around the UK. And different policy contexts and different bits of the UK taking different approaches. So the aim of this session is to facilitate shared understanding of the different approaches emerging around enhancement from development and use, to consider the connectivity between the terrestrial and marine methodologies, which are emerging as well, to explore challenges around implementation and the differences we're facing in the marine environment compared to the terrestrial environment, and overall to support understanding and a shared knowledge base on this topic area. So our speakers today, we have Janelle Braithwaite from the Marine Nature Enhancement Janelle Braithwaite, who is a Marine Nature Enhancement Policy Lead from Marine Directorate. We have Eddie Mayhew, who is a Senior Advisor from Natural England, and Paul Taylor, who is Strategic Planning Manager at NatureScot. So thank you very much to all our speakers today for accommodating taking part in the session in their very busy and hectic schedules. So just a note about the format of the session today. Some people, unfortunately, have had clashes, etc. So we've jiggled about the format slightly. So Janelle will speak first, and then immediately following Janelle's presentation, we'll take some questions from the audience on Janelle's presentation. We'll then have Eddie speaking, and then a similar format, we'll have questions after Eddie's presentation. And then we'll have Paul speaking, and then another question and answer session. So rather than having all the questions at the end, we'll take them after each presentation. I just have a couple of slides to get us into the headspace around policy approaches to enhancing the marine coastal environment. I guess one of the things that's come up in discussions with the MASTS Marine Planning and Governance Forum Steering Group is that there is a lot of terminology in this space. So this slide is just a really quick run through of some of the terminology that we might encounter today, just to kind of get us all singing from the same hymn sheet, considering that there's different terminology emerging from the different policy frameworks and from different parts of the country. So first term is nature positive, and this stems from the concept of achieving no net loss as a result of development and use, and I believe originated in the 1970s, but happy to be corrected on that, and has been more commonly used from around 2020. And this has been, devised from a desire for a clear and measurable goal for addressing the nature crisis, and to develop awareness around the need to link to climate change ambitions and sustainable development goals to the nature crisis. So nature positive as a term has been adopted into the Global Biodiversity Framework and subsequently into the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy, within the vision to have halted biodiversity loss by 2030 and to restore and regenerate biodiversity by 2045. The next term, biodiversity net gain, has come through the Environment Act 2021 in England, and this is requiring developments to leave biodiversity in a better condition than before, and the mechanism for implementation around this is coming from statutory terrestrial planning processes, which extend down to mean low water springs. So obviously introducing that interaction with the marine environment there and the overlap with marine planning processes. And then the last commonly used term is positive effects for biodiversity. This has been introduced through the National Planning Framework 4 in Scotland, largely through Policy 3 within that planning framework. And the policy intent around this is to protect biodiversity, reverse biodiversity loss, and deliver positive effects from developments. The positive outcome, again, is around biodiversity enhancement and including strengthened nature networks and supporting nature-based solutions. So I think a visual aid can be helpful when thinking about these terms. It can be helpful to think of it in terms of the mitigation hierarchy. So when we are doing development and use in any environment, there can be awareness that there are pressures. And so the mitigation hierarchy sets out to reduce those impacts following the steps of avoiding, minimizing, mitigating any adverse impacts, and where there are residual impacts, offsetting those. And really all these terms are seeking to get into this next stage of the process. So delivering a positive impact or a net gain as a result of development and use and activity. The next slide just presents a really approximate timeline of the different policy approaches which are introducing these frameworks for enhancement. So on the top in green, we have the English process. So really came through with the 25-year environment plan and has been embedded into legislation through the Environment Act, which introduced the biodiversity net gain terminology and enabled its use in town and country planning. We can see here as well the development of a biodiversity net gain metric has been ongoing for some time, with completion around 2023, with that approach becoming mandatory in 2024. Consideration and application for the marine environment in England as well was also taken forward through DEFRA consultation on marine net gain and the responses to that, and Eddie will be able to share more about that in his presentation. Looking at the purple text, this reflects the timeline of delivery around the National Planning Framework 4. So starting out with the position statement, which began to discuss positive effects for biodiversity from development, all the way through to the adoption of MPF4 in 2023 and the development of guidance, which is ongoing. In the orange text, we have the development of marine policy frameworks, which are supporting this approach. So in 2022, we had the commitment for a new national marine plan, and just in the last couple of weeks, we have had a position planning statement released as part of the process for NMP2, which is setting out some thinking on what NMP2 could be delivering in this space. And we also have the work of the Marine Nature Enhancement team, which Janelle is involved in and leading on as well. So with that, I will hand over to Janelle. I'll stop sharing my screen. And hand over to Janelle, who's going to have our first presentation, and then we'll take questions. So over to you, Janelle.
Thank you. Let me just share my presentation. Hopefully this should work for everyone. Just as a heads up, I'm at a training session today and I'm in a random room in some random building. So hopefully the network will be strong enough for it to upload my presentation. I can see the first, yes, so the first slide's there. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Janelle Braithwaite. So I work in the Marine Nature Enhancement units, and I lead on marine nature positive policy development. So I'm just going to set a little bit of the background or where this comes from, some of the challenges that we have that we've noted down when it comes to delivering marine enhancements, and then go through some, I suppose, of the opportunities or areas of policy development that either we're doing or that other people are doing and we're feeding into, because everything is all interconnected. So yeah, as it's already been mentioned, Scottish Government has significant ambitions. So we want to achieve net zero by 2045, and that's actually in the Climate Change Act, and then to be nature positive by 2030, and to have restored and regenerated biodiversity across our land, freshwater and seas by 2045. So this is where I suppose the Marine Nature Enhancement team has come into being, and again, not because we want to deliver everything ourselves or have to come up with all these new policies, but to get a bit more of a strategic footing around how do we enhance our marine environment, and what new policies are needed, what new legislation is needed, what different bits are going on, and how can we make sure that everything is moving in the right direction. So I'm just going to run through a few challenges that we have in our minds. Again, it's not an exhaustive list. I'm sure everyone here is well aware of all the different challenges in the marine environment. But I think one key challenge is actually understanding of what needs to be restored and enhanced, where, when, and how this needs to be done. And again, this is quite difficult to answer because we are in a dynamic marine environment. Everything is interconnected. Everything can happen over very large scales, and it can be, quite tricky to know what is restorable and where. Even just collecting the baseline data in order to come up with habitat suitability mapping, it's very difficult and costly. We recognise we need to work across local, regional, national and international scales because our marine environment exists on all those different scales. We need to factor in long-term, large-scale environmental change. So this is climate change. So what might be good habitat for the enhancement of an organism in a particular area might not be, in 10, 15, 20 years' time, or and how do we focus on ecosystem functionality and resilience to climate change for our marine environment? We need to balance in government to deliver for our environment, our economy, and our people. So understanding that our oceans have environmental value, they have economic value, and they have social value. And all of those are interconnected as well. We need to manage the multiple growing demands on our marine space and resources. We need to ensure that any investment in marine restoration and enhancement is responsible and is high integrity. So it's not a case of just planting some seagrass and then disappearing and it gets trawled 2 or 3 years later. It's actually how do we make sure that we are changing things in the long term? And basically, how do we do the easy things and the hard things? So it's not that everyone, when it comes to nature positive or biodiversity enhancement, that we're not just going, okay, what's the quick wins? What's the easy wins? What can we do? Is actually, how do we do the more uncertain things that could potentially have good payout at the end, but noting that we would have to take some risk on board with that. So moving on to some of the opportunities or areas of policy development. National Marine Plan 2 is a big one for us. So the Marine Plan is to support the sustainable development of our seas, protect our marine environment, and deliver for our coastal communities. As was mentioned, there's a planning position statement, and that includes a proposal that NMP2 could include a requirement for nature positive use and development to support action on tackling the biodiversity crisis. And this is beyond the application of the mitigation hierarchy that you just saw, but that the use and developments of the ocean actually deliver a positive measures for nature. So I'll just now move on. So that kind of is the planning policies are being developed around nature positive. So I'll just move on to the nature positive policy development itself, which in itself is in development. So the development's in a development and is subject to whatever happens with the National Marine Plan 2. So just take this slide with a pinch of salt at the moment. But it is that idea that, we're developing our theory of change approach on what policy interventions are required. And so we have these 3 overarching aims that we're trying to balance and aim for. And the first is that we need a set of clear policy and guidance for marine development and activities to achieve overall nature positive. we need to enable Scotland's marine industries to be able to contribute to, and they are part of, supporting the enhancement of our natural marine environment. So this is looking at lots of different avenues for in-kind contribution, for blending of public and private finance, for being able to contribute to an appropriate fund to do strategic nature positive measures that, has that long-term integrity. And then finally, that we want to achieve a sustained net improvement of the marine nature, marine natural environment over the long term to those 2030 and 2045 goals. So we're working very closely with the National Marine Plan 2 around setting those planning policies, and then we are developing our scoping and our stakeholder engagement plan at the moment, and then next year we're hoping to be able to go out to stakeholders and communities and to begin to have more of a participatory process in how these policies develop. And when we say nature positive, we don't have the statutory targets, biodiversity net gain targets like they do in England. So we're viewing, at the moment, we're viewing nature positive as something that progresses towards that real world biodiversity gain. So it might include going out to do surveys on habitat suitability for a particular organism that needs restored. That in itself won't have a biodiversity net gain, but it will be that next step in order to get that biodiversity net gain. So there is a bit more flexibility around how we define nature positive. So another, I suppose, interconnected area here is that we're developing nature positive strategic compensation policy for offshore wind. So this is the offshore wind that is going to have a significant impact on our protected sites, need to then compensate for that impact if they want to, or will apply for consent and come up with compensation measures. Now, the Energy Act came into being in 2023 that allowed for reforms in legislation around the environmental legislation for offshore wind, for governments to take strategic compensation for offshore wind, and for the establishment of one or more marine recovery funds so that developers can pay into a fund and then that fund will deliver strategic compensation. So we're doing it in this nature positive environment. So for example, I suppose moving away from this idea that you have to do what we term like for like compensation, and if you can't do that, that's it. It's going, actually, how do we have a responsible approach to be able to, if we are not able to take like for like measures, to enable wider measures, ensuring that we still protect and maximize the enhancement of our marine environment as offshore wind is developed. And again, that's all enhancement of the marine environment, and we're doing this in that nature positive context. So even though the National Marine Plan hasn't come yet, is actually setting policies around nature positive so that offshore wind are not only going to be offsetting their impact, but looking at how they can deliver a nature positive as well in all of this. So another team, or we call our teamlets, that in our group is doing a marine or developing a marine restoration plan. So there's a growing interest in marine restoration in Scotland. There's the potential for restoration activities to contribute to a healthy marine environment as well as social and economic benefits. And the first Scottish Biodiversity Strategy Delivery Plan includes a commitment to produce a marine and coastal restoration plan by the end of 2025. So there's a team in the Marine Directorate that are looking at how we're going to be or developing the marine restoration plan, and that will feed into, nature positive. If there's a nature positive action or measure that needs to be delivered, the marine restoration plan could identify some of what those measures are to deliver that. And then I just want to mention something that that I myself and people in the team are involved in is nature finance. So how do we encourage public money to come in and be invested in those high integrity marine enhancement projects? How can we blend public and private finance for that strategic gain? And so one very good example of this is the Scottish Marine Environmental Enhancement Fund. So this has, demonstrated effective cooperative action between the public and private sector towards the shared goal of protecting and enhancing our natural environment. There's lots of projects going on. They have funds granted to in several different areas. And recently they've secured a donation from SSEN Distribution to protect and restore Scottish seagrass meadows as well. And this is becoming, I believe that people from Smeath are often contacted to be like, how did you set this up? How did you get it to work? And it's fast becoming, that benchmark or that thing that people look to. So it's really good that has taken off. And then I suppose finally, we have a project going at the moment, which is developing a catalogue of marine enhancement measures for Scotland. And this catalogue is the first step towards developing a strategic approach to measures. So what needs to be done, where, what resources would be required, what is the benefit, what are the ecosystem services, what are the that it could deliver, what are the monitoring requirements, and more. And this is where it fits into that strategic approach. So if you imagine it a bit like a library, it's that, certain books up here or certain measures up here and there, that's suitable for offshore wind compensation, and they will deliver that as part of their nature positive strategic compensation policies and actions. Then there's red group, that might be nature positive actions, so that other sectors are getting involved in as part of their nature positive contribution. And then those green ones might be other investment opportunities, so through SMEF or through any kind of voluntary contributions from the private sector that are looking to deliver on their environmental objectives in their environment. So that is developing at the moment, that will help form decisions later on. And that's it. So it's a bit of a whirlwind tour. It's very much, a lot of these bits and pieces are in early development, but what we're trying to do in marine nature enhancement is to bring them all together so that the finance, the restoration plan, the nature positive planning and policies all work together towards this shared goal in the same direction.
Thank you so much, Janelle. I think we're ready to hand over to you now, Eddie, if you're ready to go to share your screen.
I will certainly try, if you bear with me. Sorry, I've got a bit of a frog in my throat today, so do forgive me if I start to croak. Just trying to share the screen now. So can you see the presentation?
Yes, that's coming up perfectly.
Excellent. Great stuff. And just bring up my notes as well. Okay. So, yes, thanks for inviting me. I was trying to think what would be best to present today. I didn't know how familiar you might be with some of the concepts around net gain, but thanks to Sinead's slide there at the start, I think we can probably move through the early slides quite quickly. I'm going to talk about biodiversity net gain. That's an existing policy. It's mandatory for most projects now in England, down to mean low water. And I'll talk you through some of the nuts and bolts about how it works, because that might link quite nicely to the previous presentation, I think, with some of the concepts. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our evidence projects that we're doing to support a marine net gain policy in the subtidal. There's an important caveat there, though, on the marine net gain side. So that's new policy that's in development. We've just had, obviously, a change of government, so we're still awaiting ministerial steers on the sort of how that's going to work in practice, and how the policy is going to develop. But having said that, we have had a high-level consultation on some of the high-level principles. So our evidence project started before the change in government, and we're going to obviously finish those in the spirit that, they're hopefully helpful applicable to a range of applications in that marine restoration space. So on the marine, when I get to the marine net gain projects, we do have some publications and other ones that are in development. There's lots of QR codes. So if you're ready with your phones, hopefully you can scan those and get taken through to various links, websites. And we do have an email newsletter as well. Right, so let's jump into it then, if I can get this to work. So what is net gain? Obviously, we've already been introduced to this, so I won't spend too long. But in the England sense, in the way it's described in policy, it's an approach to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state. That measurably word is important than before development took place. BNG has been mandatory from November. Sorry, I should say 2020. That's wrong, actually. That's out of date. It was actually February 2024. It was supposed to be November 2023, but actually it was delayed slightly for most developments that are consented under the Town and Country Planning Act. And as I said, it applies down to mean low water, so it does include the intertidal space. That came in quite late, actually. So it, as a process, it kind of evolved on land in relation to some of the big projects, in relation to road building, HS2, those kind of projects, and then eventually got regulated for, and that's when it went down to mean low water. We've already had a slide of this ilk today, so this is the mitigation hierarchy, and I show this only to demonstrate that BNG, both within, net gain within BNG, but also within marine net gain as a concept, is intended to follow the mitigation hierarchy. So you could do that outside of designated sites using, for BNG, the metric. There are, ways that you can conflate compensation as well if you are operating within a designated site. But the crucial bit is that the net gain is that what we call internally the sort of cherry on the top. It's that demonstrable gain above the baseline and above no net loss. So how does that work with the BNG metric that Sinead mentioned? So you need to use in England the statutory biodiversity metric to calculate and demonstrate that your gain either has been or will be achieved. So the first thing you do is you undertake a calculation of the biodiversity unit value of the baseline. So that's the currency, if you like, biodiversity units. And you do that for the baseline before your development takes place. You then do a second calculation of the post-intervention or the post-development biodiversity unit value. So what's changed, essentially? Has the biodiversity unit value gone up or down? And then the difference between the two calculations is your gain or your loss. If you have a loss, the gains need to be found either on-site, which is preferable in the policy, or off-site. And there's also within the BNG policy a minimum 10% net gain that needs to be achieved. So that's a fairly sort of simple, I say simple, it's some people would argue against that, but it's a fairly simple calculation. It leaves a lot out, to be honest. But another important point around the biodiversity metric is that it is iterative. We have a statutory version out there at the moment, but it will be reviewed as part of the monitoring and evaluation of biodiversity net gain. The other thing to say is that some local authorities have a higher minimum biodiversity net gain uplift value. So the EA, for example, have a 20% aspiration for net gain, and some LPAs have similar minimum requirements. So how do you calculate your biodiversity unit values? Well, they are a function of habitat distinctiveness. So we have a list of habitats within the metric from terrestrial down to mean low water. And each of those habitats has a distinctiveness score. So the more natural, the rarer habitats perhaps have a higher distinctiveness score, and the more sort of impacted ones generally have a lower score within there. So that's a numerical value. You also go and do a survey to, particularly for pre-intervention baseline, of the habitat condition, and that also gives it a numerical value, which you put into the metric. The area of the habitat is important. That's another thing that you multiply together. And then we have some multipliers around strategic significance. So is there a local plan or a regional plan for that habitat within that location, or is it desirable if you're going to deliver it as part of your gain delivery? That goes into the calculation. And also we have temporal and difficulty risk multipliers. So they are generally negative multipliers that factor in the uncertainty around your enhancement or your creation being successful. So the net result of that essentially is that if you are delivering a particularly difficult habitat, you might have to deliver more of it in area value or be more ambitious with your condition that you're trying to bring it into, just to make up for those negative multipliers. Hopefully that makes sense. I can take questions at the end on that one because it's quite a heavy concept. This is a look at the metric. You can download this for free along with any guidance that is available. It's currently sitting on the .gov.uk website. I should have put some links in here, but I can do that at the end if that's helpful. This is the main screen. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but you'll see there's the ability to open macros. It's just based in Excel at the moment. It may go digital in time. So that comes with its own flaws, but the intention here is to be as transparent as possible. So you can see what the calculation's doing and you can see how you can alter it to come up with a net gain plan that suits the developer and that provides that 10% gain. You can enter your on-site and pre and post development values. You can use those modules to work it out. You can look, if you need to, at how you might provide gains off-site and calculate what you might need to do there. And then sort of going down, the green boxes are where you need to calculate an area habitat biodiversity unit value. So that's if you have a spatial map. If you're working linearly with either hedges or watercourses, there are different modules because they have a linear value as opposed to an area one in the way that it's set up. This is just a quick look at one of the screens. I think this is the on-site habitat baseline. I've put in some habitats there. It automatically gives you their distinctiveness values. You can enter in if it's an irreplaceable version of that habitat. I've put no for these. And if it's irreplaceable, then clearly you can't get a net gain if you lose units of those because they are by definition irreplaceable. I won't go through everything there, but hopefully you can get the chance to download it and have a play. That's how I got up to speed with it. Just have a go, really. You can't really break it. It's a standalone Excel spreadsheet that you download. Now on to marine net gain. So this is beyond mean low water, so into the subtidal. So the first question that we sort of sat down to look at when DEFRA asked us to provide them with some evidence around marine net gain and how policy could work, is it possible even to deliver marine net gain over over the impact of marine developments? So linking quite well, I think, with the previous presentation, there's a lot of industry, a lot of interest that we've had from industry and obviously from the NGOs around whether they can deliver gains in some way, ranging from nature inclusive design to all sorts of other avenues for that ocean recovery piece. There's a lot of positive interest, lots of different opinions on how to define that, but we are starting now to come together and have those discussions in the round. There are different challenges. I'll go through them in a minute in relation to between marine net gain and net gain on land. There was a high-level consultation in June of 2022, and then there was a response to that, which you can download online in December this time last year. So some of those challenges. So we've broadly sort of broken these into the biophysical, ecological challenges that we might find versus the governance. I'm not going to read all of those out, but there are clearly big differences between land and sea when it comes to some of the issues of trying to mirror the BNG approach at sea. There's natural variability. Things move around a lot more. Things are influenced a lot more by other variables. There's a lot less information, understanding and data around some of those processes compared to what we have on land. It's difficult, of course, to get that information, that data compared to on land. And then in the governance space, I mean, one of the big differences that we have is land ownership, whereas we have lots of landowners that can deliver and protect gains on land. We don't have that in the marine space, which was alluded to previously. I'm going to whiz us on in the interest of time. So NE is involved in we're a very small team within Natural England, but we're doing a lot, it's fair to say, around providing evidence to DEFRA to start to develop the policy and to come up with options for ministers. The first one, which I'm working on at the moment, is the Marine Net Gain Assessment Frameworks project. So that's acknowledging that we need to have some way of measuring and comparing losses and gains between losses from development through to gains that might be delivered through various avenues, and how crucially we actually demonstrate that. So I guess a surrogate to the BNG metric on land. We did look at DEFRA's request at a simple metric that mirrors the BNG metric. And you can see there, I've tried to sort of replicate the key components of the BNG metric and then apply it to marine development and intervention. We had a workshop on that last year, which you may have come to. And there's a wide range of views, I think it's fair to say. We've had quite a lot of challenge from marine, particularly industry stakeholders, around the intertidal elements of the BNG metric. And I think a lot of that's come because they weren't involved in its evolution. So by the time they actually saw it, just ahead of BNG being regulated through town and country planning, it was a bit of a black box, I think it's fair to say, whereas a lot of those more terrestrial developers had seen it evolve and been involved in its evolution over the years. But that workshop was helpful, but I think the main conclusion we drew was that we had to step back, bring everybody into the tent and actually have those discussions from the sort of basic principles. So we set up the current project, the Marine Net Gain Assessment Frameworks project, as a way of mapping essentially what are the constraints to get us towards that final equivalent to the metric. So we started off with a technical group, and we mapped the technical constraints, the data constraints that might get us through to a process which is actually starting today, where we're looking at some of the financial constraints, the practical constraints of actually having some kind of a approach or a framework that can realistically and practically let us measure and compare losses and gains. We had a phase 1 report that came out at the back end of last year to underpin that technical group, the tag, and we're now now that we're allowed to, following that change in government, sitting down with stakeholders from all sorts of sectors to look at how we can build some ownership and consensus around an approach. We also looked at a sort of prism of approaches, starting with features. Now, these aren't designated features, but just the terminology referring to species and habitats. So if you lose, if you have impact, say, on a species population, do you need to then provide gains for that same species population, same for habitats, in a similar way to the way that the rules work for the BNG metric? Or do you need to have more flexibility and therefore move up to an ecosystem functionality trading model? We also looked at natural capital as well. Could we even expand out into having more of a natural capital asset approach to measuring and comparing losses and gains, was almost at a system level? The outcomes from the technical advisory group, which was comprised of academics and experts across consultancy, academia, and other sectors, was that for natural capital, there's not really robust enough evidence. So I have to caveat this quite carefully. So it's not robust enough now, at the current time, to be able to be meaningfully used to quantify ecological change in a regulatory framework. And it's that regulatory framework bit that's really important, thinking through to a time where this might be a legal provision that people have to deliver marine net gains over development. But that's now, and it's a bit in my head like the BNG metric, in that I imagine this framework will be iterative as we start to get a greater understanding of what's going on. We'll be able to develop the framework further. So that's not necessarily meaning that natural capital will be out of the mix forever. It's difficult to link losses to loss to gain using that metric approach. So I think we've already sort of found that out through the early exploration, unless you're delivering the gains for the same feature in the same spatial location as the loss. For a group such as marine mammals, loss and gain could be measured in a strategic level approach, but not in a feature-based approach. So the idea of trying to gain marine mammals in a place because they move around in the same way that they were lost is not going to work. But you could potentially do it at that strategic ecosystem ecosystem functionality based approach. Ecosystem modelling techniques should underpin environmental status assessment and prioritisation direction of marine gain measures in the same way, in a much more meaningful way than is currently used in regulatory decision making. So thinking about EIAs, they could be, apparently in academia, the ecosystem modelling techniques have moved on so much from the way that we currently do EIA. And there was also a strong recommendation that marine net gain delivery needs to be linked to a strategic spatial plan, and also explicitly linked through to UK Marine Strategy GES indicators. And they should form the backbone essentially of that strategic approach. Should allow for regional assessment alongside local delivery. So if you have a strategic national plan that then is broken down into regional assessments, but it also allows for that local delivery. And it should also link as a framework through to the UK MS programme of measures. And that should be a key consideration in any sufficiency assessment of those programmes of measures. So that's where I'm not going to read all this out. I'm just looking at the time, but this is where we've got to with that project. We're now just starting to talk. So we're in that middle pillar around stakeholder engagement. We've got a lot to do. The current project phase is going to end in December this year, so we should have something to publish fairly soon and to talk about. We have another project called MAREPO, Marine Restoration Potential, that's joint funded by the Crown Estate and DEFRA, and that's looking at what can be restored and where. There was a trial project last year. I'll just go back. I thought there was a slide with some QR codes. I think there is. We're currently in MAREPO Plus phase of the project. So we're doing some historic assessment of where habitats used to be, mapping some of the constraints around restoration opportunities as well, both hard and soft. And we're also branching out into species as well. So that's currently underway at the moment. Oh, here we go. So there's some QR codes there if you would like to download some of the current reports from the previous phase of MAREPO. It's a really exciting project and it's really collaborative as well, just like MNJAF. So there's lots going on there. We also have a project looking at firstly defining and coming with a definition of marine irreplaceable habitats. We've also scored the biotopes within the UNIS classification that apply to England with irreplaceability scores. So it's not binary like it is under the National Planning Policy Framework for terrestrial habitats in England, but we do have scores. So we're getting towards that place where we may have a definition and an assignment of all of the marine biotopes to irreplaceable or not. And we're currently mapping those at the moment as well. There's another QR code for you there. There we go. We've got a project at the moment with PML where we're looking to map those. And the very last one, you'll be pleased to know, is around some pilots. We're just very conscious that we're doing lots and lots of thinking, lots and lots of talking around these sort of evidence projects. What we don't currently have a grasp on is how is it going to work on the ground? How can we factor in all of those potential avenues, not just around active interventions, but also some pressure removal potentially, or pressure reduction that could contribute towards net gain? How can we secure those? How can we protect those from trawling? All of those things need to be considered, and we won't know until we start trialing some of this. So we have a scoping project underway at the moment that will report towards the end of the financial year, and then we hope to move forward, pending that ministerial steer, into some on-the-ground projects. I will stop there, and there is a final slide there. So we do have an email address where you can get through to us. We have a Marine Net Gain newsletter, so if you want to sign up for that, you can. And I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eddie. That's so interesting, so useful to see the journey from looking at a terrestrial approach and the challenges in applying it to the marine, and how that's been taken into consideration. And so we have Paul from NatureScot next to talk about the development of a biodiversity metric. Are you ready to go, Paul?
I think almost, yeah. I'll just find the right button to share.
Amazing.
That's sharing okay?
Yep, that looks good. That's in presentation mode now, yeah.
So, as you may be aware, NatureScot is currently working on development of a Scottish biodiversity metric for use in the planning system. And I'm Paul Taylor, and I'm heading up NatureScot's project team tasked with delivering this work. So at the outset, it's worth saying that the project's at a relatively early stage, especially regards our thinking on intertidal habitats. And although we haven't had a great deal of feedback on intertidal habitats, we have been made aware of some matters to consider, and I can touch on those in the second half of this presentation. Today I'll try to skip relatively quickly through the first half of the presentation before moving on to look at the specific intertidal matters that we're aware of and that we'll need to address as part of this work. So some brief background on our Scottish Biodiversity Metric project. It was commissioned by Scottish Government specifically to help support NPF Policy 3B, which requires that all national, major and EIA developments demonstrate significant biodiversity enhancement in addition to any proposed mitigation and compensation. The NPF4 policy doesn't specify a particular assessment methodology to demonstrate delivery of positive effects, but it does say that best practice assessment methods should be used. In the absence of an established Scottish metric, we know that a range of approaches are being used to measure biodiversity on development sites. And knowing this, the Scottish Government commissioned independent research last year into potential standard approaches for measuring biodiversity in Scotland. A key finding of the report was that with refinement, the English metric could be adapted for use in the Scottish planning system. The report then led to a commission from Scottish Government for us to develop a biodiversity metric to help support delivery of Policy 3B. And the project is focused on adapting the English metric for use in Scotland. I won't dwell long on this slide, enough to say that the English metric is a habitat-based tool that uses habitats as a proxy for biodiversity. Habitat type and habitat condition are manually entered into the tool by the user, whilst other scores such as habitat distinctiveness values are automatically generated by the metric. Values are multiplied together to provide a biodiversity unit value at baseline stage. And for post-development biodiversity value, the metric applies additional risk multipliers to any proposed habitat creation or enhancement work. Worth emphasising that the English planning system takes a legislative approach, prescribing a mandatory requirement for all developments to deliver a BNG or biodiversity gain uplift of at least 10%. And this has to be assessed with the metric tool. Any habitats that are created or enhanced to deliver BNG must also be maintained for at least 30 years. So to summarise, we've been commissioned to develop a biodiversity metric that specifically supports delivery of Policy 3B. We'll focus on adapting England's metric. We want to have widespread and ongoing engagement with stakeholders. The final outputs of the project will include the metric tool itself and supporting guidance and information for users. Also worth noting that the use of a Scottish metric will be different to the English metric. This reflects Scotland's policy-led approach to delivering biodiversity enhancement. And the tool will hopefully support evidence-based judgment. And while working on developing a Scottish biodiversity metric, while that's ongoing, the Scottish Government's guidance emphasises that a flexible approach will be required to avoid delays to planning decisions. So NatureScot's work on the metric project began earlier this year. Public consultation exploring the key issues that need to be addressed took place in May. We had over 90 responses from a range of stakeholders. A roundtable discussion also took place in May. We've also had various discussions with individual stakeholders through the summer. All this feedback will help inform development of the metric. We're now reviewing the foundations of the metric. We're looking at the metric rules and principles, which habitat classification system to use, and how a Scottish metric might work well for peatland and upland habitats, noting that this has been flagged as a particular priority area. Recently, we've been having focused discussions with the renewables industry and with other stakeholders. And as we move forward, we'll also be looking at distinctiveness scores, risk multipliers, habitat condition assessment criteria to ensure they're appropriate for Scotland. On timescales, we're not yet able to give a date for completion of this project due to the wide-ranging, complex nature of the work, but we do recognise the appetite for a Scottish tool. We'll be working hard to deliver as soon as we can. The English metric uses a range of established habitat classification systems, in addition to a few that are bespoke to the metric itself. For most terrestrial habitats, the English tool uses the UK HAB system. However, intertidal habitats are classified based on the UNIS system, the European Nature Information System. UNIS was chosen to classify intertidal habitats in the English metric for several reasons. It's an established and comprehensive system for classifying habitats in the intertidal environment. Secondly, it's used in reporting across the marine environment in Europe and is compatible with monitoring data of marine protected areas. And thirdly, although it would be beneficial to use all habitats for all habitats in the metric to use the same classification system, UK HAB wasn't seen to adequately include intertidal habitats. So to date, we've received no stakeholder feedback or concerns regarding the use of the UNIS system for intertidal habitats in the metric. And based on the lack of concerns raised through the consultation, it's assumed that UNIS is considered an adequate system to classify intertidal habitats. We would welcome any thoughts on that. Although those developers who work within the intertidal environment are broadly supportive of the concept of BNG or delivering positive effects for biodiversity, we understand that there have been some challenging matters raised in England regards applying the metric to intertidal habitats. So for the last part of this talk, I'll just touch on a few of these matters to give a sense of what we'll need to consider. Again, it's worth noting that so far we've had relatively little feedback from stakeholders on intertidal habitats, so we'd welcome any thoughts you might have here today. Firstly, we understand there are some concerns related to the English metric being primarily a tool for terrestrial habitats. So although it doesn't include intertidal habitats, the metric, although it does include intertidal habitats, the metric doesn't consider any habitats below low tide. This causes a concern for developments that cross from the marine environment into intertidal or terrestrial habitats, as they're unable to be fully assessed with the one metric approach. Some stakeholders have suggested the metric should extend below low tide to include marine habitats and better consideration of marine developments. However, others have indicated a preference to remove intertidal habitats from the metric entirely, keeping the metric as a purely habitat-based tool and accounting for intertidal habitats as part of the net gain approach taken for the marine environment. And there are also concerns that the English metric has not been well tested in intertidal areas, with further work required to ensure the metric works well in the intertidal environment. So we'll need to think about ways to address these fundamental issues and how to align the metric with any approaches that are adopted to deliver biodiversity in the marine environment. One example cited as showing that the English metric is not well tested in intertidal habitats is that it's seen as overly conservative in how it calculates the levels of habitat creation or restoration required to offset habitat losses and deliver a biodiversity net gain. However, this is not unique to the intertidal environment, with similar criticisms aimed at how the metric handles some terrestrial habitats, particularly those on peat. It's argued that conservation measures secured under the habitats regulations to compensate for losses of habitat features within designated European sites are effective in delivering intertidal sites for nature. And research, including some commissioned by DEFRA, is seen to support this. However, the English metric calculations can require substantially greater levels of compensation to offset intertidal habitat losses. For example, in their white paper on intertidal net gain from September 2022, ABP MER highlighted some case studies that illustrate this, and I've highlighted one here. In this case study, to satisfy the habitat regulations, a 2-to-1 compensation ratio, habitat creation to habitat loss, was identified, and the compensation delivered was perceived to successfully deliver positive environmental effects or benefits. However, when the same habitat data was input through the English metric, the metric showed that the compensation that had been delivered did not fully offset habitat losses and actually resulted in an overall loss of biodiversity. To fully offset the habitat lost and deliver a 10% net gain through the metric, in this case study, a ratio of 6.5 to 1 habitat creation to habitat lost would have been required. This is significantly higher than the habitat regulations requirements to compensate losses within designated European sites. So we'll need to review the multiplier values assigned to intertidal habitats within the metric to ensure they're appropriate. In particular, we'll need to look at how the metric handles risk involved in the creation or restoration of intertidal habitats, and whether the risk multiplier values used in the metric are supported by the evidence base. Lastly, just to briefly touch on a few other challenges that have been highlighted to us. And these are, firstly, given their dynamic nature, some suggest that a more strategic approach rather than a perhaps piecemeal approach should be applied to the application of biodiversity enhancement in intertidal habitats. And there are criticisms that a strategic approach is not sufficiently supported or encouraged through the use of a metric tool. Secondly, habitat condition assessment criteria for intertidal habitats need to be reviewed to ensure that they're appropriate for the Scottish context. For example, we'll need to ensure the list of negative indicator species for each intertidal habitat type are relevant in Scotland, and there will need to be some flexibility to refine these over time to account for climate change related introductions or other required changes. And thirdly, it's been suggested that the metric needs to include better recognition of green infrastructure within intertidal habitats. So just to highlight in closing that there's a web page on the metric project that's recently gone live on the NatureScot website, as well as providing an outline of the metric work. We intend to publish further updates and early signalling of the intended approach on this web page as the metric project progresses. And if you have any thoughts that could assist with the development of the metric, we'd love to hear them, and you can email us at the address on the screen. Thank you. That's it, I think.
Thank you so much, Paul. Really, really useful to see the development of the Scottish metric and how learnings from the English process have been taken into account. Thank you very much to all the speakers for providing presentations today and accommodating this session within a very busy schedule and various clashes as they arose while we were planning the session. So thank you very much to them. Thank you very much for MASTS to Phil and Chrissy for the support in arranging the open forum session. And thank you very much to everybody for attending. We hope that's been useful. And if there are any other topic areas that people would like to hear about that the MASTS, that sort of align with the MASTS Marine Planning and Governance Forum area, then please do let us know and we'll see what we can do in terms of facilitating other sessions. But obviously there are other forums working in other topic areas as well. So there are other avenues for taking forward different sessions. So thank you very much and good to see everyone and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.